The air in the high Cascades always grew thick by late afternoon, the scent of damp pine needles and heavy cedar settling into the low valleys of the Oregon wilderness. Joel, Marcus, and Denny were 2 days into what was supposed to be a standard 4-day loop through a densely forested sector of national land. They were not amateurs. Joel had been packing these ridges since his 20s. Marcus was an ex-infantryman who could read a topo map in his sleep. Denny, though quieter, had completed the Pacific Crest Trail twice. They were the kind of men who viewed the wilderness as an equation to be solved, not a place to get spooked by shadows or nighttime noises. That certainty began to fray around 3 o'clock on the second afternoon. They had been following a dry, gravelly creek bed that Marcus swore connected back to the main ridge trail, but the terrain had flattened out unexpectedly. The thick canopy of ancient Douglas firs seemed to lean inward, blocking out the sun until the light turned a dull, bruised gray. When Joel pulled up his handheld GPS, the screen flickered, the satellite tracker spinning in a useless, erratic circle before the screen died completely. Marcus unrolled their heavy paper topographic chart across a flat boulder, tracing his finger along the coordinates. The wide, flat clearing they were standing in simply did not exist on the map. According to the contours, they should have been on a steep 40-degree incline between 2 ridge lines, not standing in a perfectly level, grass-covered meadow tucked away from the wind. But it wasn't the mapping error that made the 3 men stop dead at the edge of the tree line. It was the campsite. Right in the center of the clearing sat a large, meticulous setup. 3 green dome tents were staked out in a perfect, neat row, their lines taut and precise. In front of the tents, a stone-lined fire pit held a low, steady bed of orange coals, sending a thin ribbon of pale smoke straight up into the still air. A heavy cast-iron pot sat directly over the embers, the lid rattling slightly as something thick and savory simmered inside. Arranged around the fire pit were 3 folding camp chairs, spaced at exact intervals. In front of each chair, sitting flat on the stamped earth, was a single tin camping cup. "Hello!" Joel called out, his voice sounding thin and instantly swallowed by the dense forest. "Anybody here?" The only response was the gentle bubbling of the iron pot. Marcus instinctively shifted his heavy pack, his eyes scanning the surrounding timberline with a hunter's scrutiny. There were no boot prints leading out of the clearing, no discarded gear, no trash, and no sound of anyone gathering wood. The clearing was dead silent. "Maybe they're down at the water source," Denny suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. He walked closer to the fire pit, the smell of the simmering stew hitting him. It smelled fresh, rich, and perfectly seasoned. He reached out and touched the handle of the cast-iron lid. It was white-hot, requiring a bandana to lift. Whoever did this was here less than 5 minutes ago. The coals are perfectly tended. Marcus walked the perimeter of the site, his brow furrowed. "Something's wrong with the way this is laid out," he muttered, pointing a gloved finger at the 3 camp chairs. "Look at the positioning. They aren't angled outward toward the mountain view or the valley below. They're facing strictly inward, locked right onto each other, like whoever sits there doesn't want to look at the trees behind them." "Let's just give them 15 minutes, Joel said, sitting down on a nearby log, though he kept his backpack securely strapped to his shoulders. "We're miles off trail. It's bad etiquette to mess with someone's camp. They'll be back." The 15 minutes ticked by in grueling silence. The afternoon light grew steadily dimmer, the gray shadows lengthening across the meadow. Nobody came out of the woods. As they waited, the smaller details of the site began to grate on Joel's nerves. He stood up and approached the 3 tents. Every single one of them was zipped completely shut from the outside. the metal tabs pulled all the way down to the dirt stakes. It was a small thing, but an experienced hiker never fully zips a tent from the exterior if they are just stepping away for a moment. It traps air and makes the nylon sweat. Marcus, losing patience, stepped up to the center tent. "I'm looking inside," he said flatly. He knelt in the dirt and pulled the zipper up. The sharp screech of the metal teeth felt incredibly loud in the quiet clearing. He peered into the dark interior for a long moment, his body going completely rigid. "What is it?" Joel asked, stepping up behind him. Marcus didn't answer right away. He slowly zipped the flap back down, his face pale when he stood up to face the others. "Don't touch anything," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a hard, military clip. "Inside that tent, there are 3 sleeping bags laid out flat. On top of the first one is a leather bifold wallet. On the second one is a set of truck keys on a brass ring. On the third one is a folded, glossy photograph." He looked directly into Joel's eyes. "I didn't open the wallet, but I recognize the design. It looks exactly like yours, Joel. And those truck keys? They have the same exact Ford lanyard Denny carries." A cold, heavy dread dropped into Joel's stomach. "You're seeing things, Mark. It's just standard gear." "We need to leave, right now," Marcus said, ignoring him and tightening the chest strap of his pack. "This isn't a random hunter's camp. We are getting back to the ridge." Denny, who had been sitting quietly by the fire, stood up sluggishly. His lips were chapped, his face flushed with the exhaustion of the long hike. "Yeah, okay. Let me just get a quick drink from the creek first." He looked down at the fire pit, his eyes landing on the 3 tin cups sitting in the dirt. Without thinking clearly, driven by pure fatigue, he reached down and picked up the cup closest to his boot. The metal was cool against his palm. He tilted it toward the fading light, intending to see if it was clean. His thumb brushed against the interior bottom of the tin, feeling a rough, jagged texture. Denny went entirely still. The color drained from his face so fast it looked as if he might faint. "Denny?" Joel stepped forward, reaching out a hand. "What's wrong?" Denny didn't speak. He simply held the cup out, his hand shaking so violently the tin clicked against his fingernails. Joel took the cup and shone his headlamp down into the small cylinder. Scratched deeply into the raw metal at the bottom of the cup, written in jagged, frantic capital letters with something sharp like a hunting knife, was a name. Dennison Earl Waverly. It wasn't a common name. It wasn't a nickname. It was Denny's full, legal name, the one printed on his birth certificate and his driver's license. "Run!" Marcus barked. They didn't gather their bearings. They didn't consult the useless map. They simply turned and bolted back into the dense timber, scrambling up the steep, rocky incline of the dry creek bed they had descended hours before. They ran blindly, their heavy packs slamming against their backs, branches whipping across their faces and tearing at their jackets. Nobody talked about the cups. Nobody talked about the wallets or the keys. They just moved with a frantic, animalistic desperation, their breath coming in ragged, burning gasps as they clawed their way upward through the dark underbrush. An hour of brutal climbing passed before they finally crashed through a thick wall of blackberry brambles and felt their boots strike the solid, packed earth of the main ridge trail. They stopped, collapsing against the wooden trail marker, their chests heaving as they sucked in the cold night air. The sun had completely set now, leaving the forest in a deep, impenetrable indigo. Joel turned around, holding his flashlight in a trembling hand, and cast the beam back down into the dark valley they had just escaped. The light cut through the trees, illuminating the thick trunks and the shifting fog. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. He stopped moving entirely. "Joel, what is it?" Marcus whispered, his hand instinctively dropping to the hunting knife at his belt. At the very edge of the far tree line, down where the ridge sloped into the hidden meadow, 3 figures were standing. They were positioned perfectly in a row, spaced out at the exact same intervals as the 3 tents. They were too far away to make out faces or clothing. They were just tall, still silhouettes cut out against the faint gray of the clearing behind them. They didn't move. They didn't call out. They didn't wave. They just stood there, their blank forms locked onto the 3 hikers, watching them with an absolute, terrifying stillness. "Don't look," Marcus growled, grabbing Joel's shoulder and violently yanking him around. "Keep moving. We hike out tonight. We don't stop." They marched through the night, their headlamps cutting narrow tunnels through the pitch black. They didn't stop to rest, they didn't filter water, and they didn't speak a single word to one another. The silence between the 3 friends had turned into a hard, defensive wall. Every time the wind rustled the pines, every time a small animal scurried through the brush, their hearts leaped into their throats. At 5:30 in the morning, the trees finally cleared, and the gravel parking lot of the ranger station appeared under the pale light of dawn. The men looked like ghosts, covered in mud, their clothes torn, their eyes bloodshot and hollow from exhaustion. They pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the station, the bell above the door chiming softly. A middle-aged ranger in a crisp green uniform was sitting behind the high counter, a mug of coffee in his hand. He looked up, his expression entirely unbothered by their disheveled appearance. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" the ranger asked smoothly. Joel stepped forward, his hands resting heavily on the counter to keep himself steady. "We need to report something. We got lost off the ridge trail yesterday. We found a clearing, a campsite, 3 tents, a fire burning, food cooking. But no one was there, and there were things there. Things that belonged to us. Our names." The ranger didn't blink. He didn't look surprised, and he didn't reach for a radio. He simply reached under the counter and pulled out a thick, black 3-ring binder covered in faded reference labels. He opened it to a large, plastic-slipped topographic map of the district. "Show me where you think you were," the ranger said, sliding a black felt-tip pen across the wood. Marcus stepped up, his finger tracing the ridge trail until he found the dry creek bed. He pointed to the blank, unmarked space between the 2 contour lines where the GPS had failed. "Right here, in this pocket, there's a flat meadow." The ranger took the pen back. Without a word, he drew a neat, tight circle around the blank area Marcus had indicated. Inside the circle, he wrote today's date, July 3rd, 2026. Then, he closed the binder with a heavy, definitive snap. "What does the date mean?" Joel demanded, his voice rising with a frantic, nervous energy. "What is out there?" The ranger leaned forward, resting his forearms on the counter. He looked at all 3 of them slowly, his eyes shifting from Joel to Marcus and finally lingering on Denny's pale face. "That's the 3rd time in 4 years someone has brought me those exact coordinates," the ranger said, his voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. "The forest is big out here. Things get mismapped." "That doesn't explain the campsite," Marcus snapped. "Who belongs to those tents?" "The first group that found that clearing was back in 22, the ranger continued, ignoring Marcus's outburst. "They came in here looking just like you boys do. Told the same story about a warm fire and a pot of food. The second group came through last summer." He paused, taking a slow sip from his mug. "The thing is, when the first 2 groups walked into this station, there were only 2 people standing at the counter instead of 3, and neither group could ever explain where their 3rd man went. They just said they started running through the trees, and when they hit the trail, he was gone." The room went deathly cold. Denny swallowed hard, his hand gripping the strap of his pack until his knuckles turned white. The ranger reached under the desk one more time and slid a white official incident disclosure form across the counter. "I need you to fill this out for the federal log. Standard procedure for off-trail incidents. Just write down your personal details." Denny reached out a trembling hand and picked up the metal pen attached to the clipboard. He pulled the form closer to his face, ready to write his name. He froze. The pen slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the wood. Printed cleanly at the very top of the official federal document, typed in perfect, sterile digital ink before any of them had even introduced themselves, were 3 names arranged neatly in a row. Joel Miller, Marcus Vance, Dennison Earl Waverly. Underneath the names, the form was completely blank, the empty white rows waiting for the narrative of a night that had already been recorded before they ever left the trees.